Welcome to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert, and we're in the studio today with ISF Managing Director Steve Durbin. If you missed our previous episode about the Threat Landscape 2019 overview, be sure to visit the media page at securityforum.org for that conversation. Today, we're bringing you the first in our 4-part series of conversations that explore the greatest areas of threat. And we're focusing this first discussion on the increased sophistication of cybercrime and ransomware. Steve, cybercrime has been around forever, so what's different about it this time out?
Yeah, cybercrime, Tavia, is a very interesting topic. I mean, it's a part of the market, if you like, that continues to grow. So last year, it was estimated at being at something like a $600 billion business. That translates into about 2.7 million of us being attacked on a daily basis, so becoming victims of cybercrime. And it's something, I think, that from a market growth standpoint, we're going to see continue to expand. So it's relevant, I think, for organizations and indeed individuals. It's not something that's going to go away. And we're seeing it increase in sophistication, as you said in the beginning there. And there are a couple of reasons why that's happening. I think certainly the overall landscape is becoming broader. So there is more opportunity for cybercriminals. One of the things that they are very good at doing is collaborating, is sharing information. They work together very often, irrespective of geography. They also have, I think, acquired a much bigger level of patience, if I could put it that way. So gone are the days when they're intent on making perhaps a quick hit. There is much more thought that we're starting to see going into cybercrime operations. So, living on your network for a little bit longer, trying to understand what the things are that you're doing, looking at how they might exfiltrate information that's important, making sure that they understand the level of response that they can expect, whether that be from law enforcement or indeed from your own network administration and security. So those are changing things significantly as well. And I think the other thing is that there is a lot of money to be made in it. Let's not beat about the bush. I mean, there's some very interesting statistics that came out of our recent annual Congress in Las Vegas just around that. And some of the ones that I remember were in 1991, for instance, in the United States, there was something like just over 9,000 bank robberies that netted criminals $250 million. In 2016, that had decreased to 3,700, netting only 17 million, so going down. This year, in 2018, there were 4 cryptocurrency exchange hacks that netted $773 million.
Wow.
So you can see the scale.
Right.
And you're reducing the level of risk as well from a criminal standpoint. You don't have to physically turn up. You can very easily hide by using the internet. And it makes it very difficult for law enforcement to catch you. So I think as an industry, as a market, it's certainly one that we're going to see continue to grow.
So cybercrime is maturing.
Yeah, absolutely. No question about that. I've talked before with you about crime as a service, about the fact that on the darknet you can really access and buy different packages that allow you to get started. Some of them come with fairly sophisticated help desks and support infrastructures and guarantees. So it really is an industry. And, that is something, again, that I think perhaps a lot of people don't fully appreciate when we talk about cybercrime. And the challenge for law enforcement, of course, is keeping abreast with that because they have limited resources too. And so I think we are starting to see, not intentionally, but we're starting to see, I think, a move towards law enforcement starting to focus resources on the bigger crimes. And again, cybercriminals understand that. So we are beginning to see some of them, implement certain thresholds above which they won't go. And so really operating under the radar so that they can pretty much guarantee that they'll get away with some of the criminal activity that they're undertaking.
I want to ask you about spear phishing, but before we move on to that, I just want to highlight something I've never heard you say before, that there are actually guarantees built in. I mean, it's like cybercrime as a career, an organized... I mean, that fascinates me, a guarantee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, if we look at it, it is a fully operating business, a sector, a market. I think if we look back over just not that many years, It started out as certainly the sorts of things that people were doing in garages. Well, okay, we can draw a parallel there with the IT industry, can't we? There's well-documented evidence of very large corporations today having started out like that. You did require a degree of specialism, but we saw, a number of key individuals come in, start to determine the way in which the landscape was going to operate, begin to reach out to other skill sets in other parts of the world. So if you're based in the US, reaching out, say, to the Ukraine or to other parts to acquire certain skills to help you commit crimes, and really making full use of the internet to do that, and more recently, of course, the darknet. So I think that it is a well-structured business. It is one where the returns are particularly high. If we look at just something like ransomware, for instance, then, again, in just last year, that was estimated at being something in between a $5 to $8 billion business. So quite a nice little segment. Mm-hmm. And that's continuing to morph and change as well. And that's a cause for concern. I think in the beginning, when we looked at ransomware, there was a fairly decent chance that if you paid a ransom, then you would get your data back. Now, not that anybody was ever suggesting that you should do that. And in fact, advice from people like the FBI and other law enforcement agencies was that you don't do that. However, there is a reality. And, very many organizations did do that. And we still see some of that happening. And again, there are particular criminal gangs that, again, have their own help desks that will help you to get back up and running once you've paid the money. But the industry has changed. And so we also have ideologists that have come into it. We also have people who are perhaps not quite as skilled in that area. And really from a business model standpoint, we're starting to see that the ransomware space being spoiled a little bit. Paying a ransom or getting or extracting a ransom depends very much on you playing by the rules. So there is an assumption for the model to work effectively that if I ask you for a certain amount of money and you give it to me, that I will return your goods to you. And in that environment, the model works very well. Mm-hmm. We all understand the rules. However, if you change it and use it just as a means of extracting cash or payment, but don't return the data, then that spoils the model. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, now there is this doubt at the back of your mind that even if you do pay the money, are you going to be able to get your information back? So we're starting to see some of that coming about. And, of course, ideologists will always go down that particular route. So organizations in particular need to be particularly aware if they're going to be targeted in that particular space. So ransomware has changed slightly. We expect to see that continue to grow. It grew last year by something like 350 to 400%. Wow. So again, quite a nice growth if we're looking at that from a business standpoint. That's an area I think that organizations certainly need to be aware of, because it isn't just changing from an ideological standpoint, from a traditional model standpoint, but it's also changing from this let's be a little bit more patient about it standpoint. We all know that a cybercriminal can live on your corporate network for a significant period of time.
Sure.
We are starting to see very much more of that watching, listening. Why is that important? Well, one of the concerns that certainly I'm hearing now is that it isn't just your day-to-day systems that are being infected with ransomware, but it's also your backups. Because clearly that then compels you even more to pay up. So there have been a number of instances where organizations have lost access not just to their day-to-day operation, but also where the backups have been encrypted too. And so we're starting to see this sort of air gapping of data vaults that are coming in. And this really reminds me of the way that it used to be in the old mainframe era, where at the end of the day, you would collect your mainframe tapes or disks or whatever it happened to be and remove them from the computer room and store them, lock them up in a safe. So it's interesting to just sort of see how perhaps this notion of over-the-air backup is becoming perhaps something that we want to reconsider, and the area of reverting, if you want to look at it that way, to air gapping and to physical storage of data is becoming a little bit more popular in certain areas. So that's just an interesting area, I think, in which ransomware is developing and changing.
Let's talk about spear phishing. What can you tell us about the threat that spear phishing poses?
Yeah, I think in 2019 we're certainly going to see more spear phishing. So this is the particular targeting of individuals. A lot of information, of course, is available on individuals, whether you gather that through social media, whether you gather it through public information that is published. around companies and so on. And so in particular, I think the sorts of people that we need to be worrying about are the CEO, the CFO, perhaps the financial controller, people who really have access into some of the most important elements of an organization. And very often they are people who perhaps don't follow the security guidelines to a T. Now, I'm sure that there'll be all forms of shock and horror from listeners about that are CEOs and CFOs who will tell me that of course they do, and I don't know what I'm talking about. But they are targets. That's the point. And again, when it comes down to cybercrime, if you are a target, there is actually not a lot that you can do, because you will actually be attacked in some way, shape or form. Your data will be stolen, used, or whatever it may be. So I think that, again, from an organizational standpoint, we need to look very hard at how we can protect not just the people, but more importantly, I would say the information. So I would certainly recommend that all organizations really understand better their information flows. Look very hard at who needs to be accessing certain information and from where and when, and put in place security systems that really do flag behavior that is out of pattern. Now, a lot of people will have that already. But of course, it becomes very much more complicated when we start talking about the C-suite. Some of them don't particularly encourage that. They wouldn't want that to happen. And so I think this really points out the need, I think, for board involvement, for the board to be fully cognizant of the risks that are being run across the organization, of the way in which they want to manage their own security posture and indeed the security posture of the organization, and to, I think, put in place some specific means and methods, both to raise the level of awareness in the sort of people that I've just been referring to, but also across the enterprise around the importance of handling information. So I think, unfortunately, spear phishing is something that we're going to see certainly become more common in 2019. But, the good news is that there are certain things that we can do about it to make life a little bit more difficult for the cyber criminal.
Well, talk to us about that. I heard you say there's not a lot that we can do, but what can companies and individuals within those organizations do to protect themselves?
There are some key things that we can do there. The first is around education. It is about letting people know what good practice might look like. I mean, we all use our smartphones or our tablets to access information. It is about, for instance, encrypting, to make sure that if you do lose a physical device, then it can't be used by anyone else. Again, those organizations that recognize that as a particular challenge are very advanced in terms of encrypting and the way in which they back up information and so on. So I think it's about raising the level of education and awareness beyond, don't access important information from an airport or from a coffee shop and that kind of thing. And that's something that we can very easily put in place. Not quite so easy to monitor, of course, but we can go through that process. I think the second thing that we can do is to really look at what I always call cyber basics. It's to make sure that we do have things like passwords implemented effectively, that we have patched, that our software is up to date. I would recommend running some regular phishing scams as well across an organization, just so that people get used to the fact that they shouldn't be clicking all the time. It's very important, if you do that, though, to have feedback in the moment. So if you do click on something you shouldn't do, and it is part of a training program, to get that fairly instant response, because that's how people remember these things. I think it's also about, reassessing, as I said before, the level of information that you've got across the enterprise and who is accessing it and from where. And to take a fairly stringent approach to that. So really question, who does need to be accessing information and from where. There are certain people that I know in the C-suite, for instance, who simply won't have access to things like their financial systems or their HR systems when they're on the road. For me, that is a good way of working. I think there are very, very few of us that need to be accessing that level of information if we're away from the office. And there are obviously ways around it. So I think those are some of the basics in there. I think the other thing is about cooperation. It's about cooperation across the enterprise. It's about getting regular briefings into the boardroom from security around awareness, around risk, around the different postures and the implications of some of the decisions that are being made from a security standpoint. It's about cooperation across sectors. We are starting to see attacks moving from some of the more traditional sectors, so finance, for instance, that's always been under attack, across into things like retail, travel. So I think that there is an opportunity for us to be sharing some of the learnings, say from the financial services space, with some of these other sectors that are now becoming increasing targets for cybercrime attacks. So those are just some of the ways I think that we can really deal with it.
Our conversations never fail to surprise me, so I'm glad to have you back and be surprised once more. Corporations cannot ignore the increasing threats posed, and proactive enterprises will seek out every remedy and resource they can. Next time you're in the studio, Steve, let's move to that second area of threat that you have pointed to as a top concern in 2019. Let's discuss next the impact of legislation on the threats posed by cybercriminals and see what guidance you have for our listeners there. Until we return, for valuable resources, more important and timely conversations, and tools that will help you safeguard your data privacy, visit securityforum.org. And listeners, we want to hear from you. If there's a guest you'd like us to bring into the studio, a topic you'd like to hear covered, get in touch with us. You can tweet us at Security Forum or send a message through our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon.